In this lesson, we're going to be talking about the power of storytelling. Now, when I say the word storytelling, for some, it sounds like being in an experience where someone goes on endlessly telling their story. We're going to talk about that. For some, storytelling sounds like an idea that is so foreign to them because they don't believe they have any good stories to tell. We're going to talk about that. And for some, storytelling sounds like I start off pretty well, but I don't finish in a strong way. We're going to talk about that as well. Storytelling is really a part of any message that you send, whether it is a personal branding message, whether it is your sales presentation, or whether it is you are getting up to actually give a presentation or speak in front of people. You're going to use the same structure that we discussed in lesson 5, creating a strong framework. That is, you begin with an overarching theme, really what the story is, the importance of the story to you is encapsulated within what we call a bumper sticker. It's the title, it's the headline, it's that short phrase that does beg the question how, what, or why, which is the driver of the story, the forward momentum. Then you get to describe the 3 reasons that unfold, making your story make sense. And then you return to the bumper sticker at the end of your story so that you're closing the loop. So you're using, again, listening behaviors and creating a strong framework in order to tell your story. So keep that in mind when you think about stories that start out well, but don't end well. Just make sure that you reiterate what that opening phrase was right at the end. That will give closure, listening satisfaction to your listeners. Plus, it will give a nice button on the story and signify that you are done speaking. It's a good way to put on the brakes. Now, in terms of content, this is a good exercise. This lesson is going to be a good exercise in being able to formulate that content. Eventually, like with so many of the things that we talk about here in the various lessons of the bootcamp, you will get better at this over time. But I do highly advise that you prepare and you practice this, that you give it some thought. And even more than that, that you actually practice telling these stories out loud. I don't want you to be surprised by the sound of your own voice telling these stories. And remember, use good breathing, use good coordinated gestures. 50% of your message is body language. Don't leave out half the story. So the 3 stories that I recommend that you consider in your practice, they are, number 1, the mentor story. Number 2, the overcoming challenges story. And number 3, the leadership story. All of these 3 stories are also the stories that I recommend all of my clients use when they come to me for job interview prep. Having stories in your back pocket makes going to a networking event easier, makes going to a job interview easier, even makes being at a dinner party or a social gathering a little bit easier. I'm not saying you will always have an opportunity to tell all of your stories, but knowing that you have these 3 is knowing that you have multi-purpose stories at your disposal. So let's take a look at the first of the stories, the mentor story. The mentor story is a story about someone who had an impact on your life. It could be a teacher, a coach, a manager, a fellow student, a coworker, or a family member, just not a parent. It could be a sibling, it could be an aunt or an uncle, it could be a grandparent. Any of those people, think for a moment, someone who had that impact, made a difference, pointed you in the right direction, gave you encouragement to go where you needed to go. In other words, took you under their wing, showed you the ropes, encouraged you to keep going in that direction. When you think about this person and the telling of this story as one of your important top 3 stories, always utilize their name. You can use their first name. There's no problem in using their last name as well. You're going to be giving them praise. Then you do want to describe what the relationship is and what the circumstances were that caused the relationship to flourish, what your connection to that person is. So be clear about framing what the story is all about. These are important details for you to know ahead of time because you'll see how they pay off a little bit later in terms of story integration. Once again, I cannot emphasize enough that however you start should be the way that you finish. This again is leveraging listening behaviors. You are then closing the loop. So, the beauty of the mentor story is that for many people, talking about themselves is something that's a little foreign or something that they're not quite comfortable with, especially if you are networking and meeting people for the first time. For many, speaking about somebody else is much easier. So, when you're describing the qualities that you saw in this person that had an impact on you, the interesting thing is that as much as you are describing them, you are actually talking about yourself. So keep that in mind in terms of storytelling. This could be a really good story for you if you feel at all uncomfortable about being sounding boastful or talking about yourself. The mentor story is certainly the story that I advise on a job interview to put right at the top of the list because it shows so many different qualities if you're going on a job interview or if you're working with people that you want to have a continuing relationship with. It does show an appreciation for someone who was willing to give of their time and of their energy. It shows gratitude on your part and a willingness to one day be a mentor yourself. The second story that I mentioned is the overcoming challenges story. And I would say most of the time, the challenges that come to mind first are usually work related challenges, but consider personal challenges as well, because they often show a side to us that would not be normally talked about in a networking event that was business related. It's a breath of fresh air if you can talk about personal challenges as well. And it really doesn't matter if it's a personal challenge or if it is a work challenge. And also, don't forego talking about the challenge of having to do something that seems fairly mundane, but still everyone can relate to because it is something that's challenging. What you want to do is describe your thought process. Because even if the person who's listening doesn't has never gone through the same experience, they will still recognize that sense of recognizing what a problem is and then the approach to finding that solution. Once again, in preparing these stories, always go back to the opening statement. It's really important that you follow that strong framework, that strong pyramid of ideas, and return back and close the loop. Once again, overcoming challenges are things that we understand. I equate these kinds of stories to the idea that to talk about an award that you won is not as important or not as impactful as talking about what it felt like to win the award. The third story I recommend that you work on and you prepare is what I call the leadership story. Now, this sounds like a fairly common request when you go on a job interview, or it seems like something that you would probably talk about at a networking event, or even something that you might bring up to make a connection in a face to face client sales opportunity. Make sure that the leadership story is not based on your work title or your responsibilities. Dig a little bit deeper. This should be a situation where someone needed to step up and they needed to take charge. And you were that person who grabbed the bull by the horns and did what needed to be done. Rallied the troops, organized. You were the leader, and people did follow. Once again, make sure that the way you start off this story is also the way you close the loop. So you notice that there is a consistent approach. We're using a strong framework. We're making sure that we close the loop. That's vitally important because you need to understand that many of these stories will often be told in several different lengths, depending on what scenario you find yourself in. Normally, if you're in a job interview, you want to tell a story of maybe 2 to 3 minutes. That would change if you're in a networking event. Suddenly, that becomes a much shorter story. It could go to 2 or 3 minutes, but you want to be prepared in various scenarios to be able to change the way you go about closing the loop, but still you make sure you close the loop. Be aware some of those details will get trimmed away as you trim down the length of time. So be aware of the situation that you're in. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, if you're at a dinner party and you're seated next to someone and you are chit-chatting and sharing stories, you might elongate that story a bit more because it might require that you speak for more than just 2 minutes about something. So be aware that these stories can be told in different lengths and should be prepared. And you should be aware going into a situation that there's a very good chance that you will be telling it in a different length than maybe the last time that you had told the story. These stories can change. But for so many of the clients that I've worked with over the years, they've never really taken the time to figure out what these stories are. Now, you may have experiences in a daily life that you will learn how to fashion into a story using a lot of this advice that I'm giving. It may not be a mentor story, it may not be an overcoming challenges, and it may not be a leadership. It might be a different story. It might be a travel experience story. It might be a vacation story. What I'm saying is that these three stories, the mentor story, the overcoming challenges story, and the leadership story, are meant to flesh out some of the qualities that you do want to project in your personal branding, also in your sales presentations, and in your public speaking. They all do have a place because there's an authenticity that you want to make sure that you project in all of those scenarios. Stories are a wonderful way to do this. They're also great for another reason. Stories are an easy way to really lean into listening behaviors. In order for someone to feel that listening satisfaction, they need to have certain boxes checked. And I've really broken those down into four major boxes, and they are you projecting your experience, your understanding, your aspiration, and your ability. So many of these stories can check multiple boxes. This is the nuts and bolts of what people do want to hear. You're allowing these simple stories, which are easy for you to remember, to check these boxes for you. So they are doing an enormous amount of work in making people want to connect with you. Now, if you look at something like the mentor story, that's certainly a sense of what your understanding and your aspiration is. If you're talking about overcoming challenges, well, there's experience, understanding, and even ability. Leadership is once again a feeling of probably all four of those: experience, understanding, aspiration, and ability. So by telling those stories and many like them, you will be checking off the necessary listening boxes that listeners do need to hear. Now, one of the biggest challenges after you've prepared stories is giving yourself permission to use them. There will never be a time, or at least I've never experienced a time when somebody has said to me, Paul, please tell me one of your stories. Wouldn't that be nice? But that's not the kind of thing that happens. So you have to listen for words, keywords, words that have to do with your relationships, both to your mentor, to the circumstances, or to descriptive adjectives that you already know are a part of your stories. That's why you need to know them so well. That's why you need to come up with a headline or a bumper sticker, because often within the emotion and the perspective of that bumper sticker will be the strongest descriptive adjectives. Of course, you can make most of your stories fit into just about any conversation, but in the beginning, as you're giving yourself permission to utilize these stories, you do want to listen for those words from the other person's conversation that make it an easy segue into these stories. Again, your relationship words, your circumstance details, and descriptive adjectives. So you can see there is a method to storytelling. Once you understand that you have to utilize framework, you've got to practice all of this, but then the integration is a matter of giving yourself permission. My hope is that by you doing the homework here in lesson 7, that you'll get more confident in being a storyteller. Remember, people like to hear things in this manner.